I'm Dane Rose, and I want to start out in this video by giving a couple of perspectives and some context that might lead you to look at this video in a different light. Now, since exploring trauma and with it the full range of emotions, including some of the darkest human emotions I've experienced at high intensity, one conclusion and one direction of thought that I've had is, just how dreadful everything is, how negative. But there's another outlook, and that is that if you look at the human spirit and human nature, and you understand all of the different blockages and environmental challenges that we each face as human beings, and we understand just how often these push the probability field in a certain direction, then the triumphs, the human successes, it's kind of like a video game where if all you had to do was walk across the screen and you won, it's like, okay, there's no problems and you won. But when you have obstacles coming at you at 1 to 5 second intervals, from this side and this side and this side, and you have to get to multiple levels. You've got all these different variables. If you get to the end of a 40-year marathon in that kind of a game and win, it's really a testament to the perseverance, the challenge of the individual. So this is, the first perspective, that the fact that I'm here, the fact that you're there, the fact that we're both alive in the context of all of these different things that we face as human beings is really the story. In Joseph Campbell's language, it might be the journey of the hero. The second thing I want to highlight is the fact that as a consciousness, as a culture, and as individuals, we embody a certain percentage, a certain domain in the overall possibility and probability field of the human psyche. That there have been 10,000 cultures and languages estimated by anthropologists. And we are a very, 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 very tiny part of the human probability field. The whole of Western culture is just this very, very, very small sliver of all that is possible for human consciousness. And so one of the things that I've been very aware of is the phenomena and the experience where certain parts of me in the culture are rewarded greatly. For example, my business skills. I couldn't be more happy as a business owner. The ability to make money in the United States, if you care enough about it, to study it and learn it and just apply it with some discipline, is phenomenal. You can make a ton of money relatively easily in the United States. But that does not mean that you can have male friendships of a certain emotional nature and a certain quality and intensity relatively easy in America. In other words, that the part of me that is engaged in making money is met and partnered with quite consistently and effectively. The part in me that seeks deep, meaningful, quality time male friendships has never been met in the United States. You know, we're talking 3 men in my entire life that somewhat reluctantly and hesitantly joined in a 1 to 2 year relationship of cautious, semi-transparent friendship before deciding it's a little bit too much. And that's over 40 years and exposed to, you know, probably 30,000 men in that time frame, that any one of which could have walked up and in another culture, in another time, in another value system, said, I'm looking for a great male friend to have a high quality of transparency and partnering to support each other in our lives. Not gay and not wanting to be sexual. Are you interested? And no one has. And the answer would have been yes to almost all of those 30,000 people, in part because it would be so unusual to meet a man wanting to invest that kind of time. So one of the tricks of culture is to convince its people that its way is the only way. And by focusing consciousness, for example, we have all these magazines about money, we have all these magazines about physical health and diet, we have all these magazines about sex, so those are relatively covered in our culture. Haven't seen all those magazines about deep, meaningful male friendship or emotional literacy. You know, do you know how to turn a single emotion into another emotion consciously, and do you know how the chemistry of emotion is built, or which environments systematically produce what kind of emotions for you and for a partner? I've never run into that. And so another thing that I want to draw attention to is that we can feel grief, and one of the griefs that we do feel but may not have processed is the griefs about the parts of ourselves that wanted to be born, that wanted to connect, and that had no location, no opportunity. It's like a redwood seed that wanted to get planted and grow into a redwood, but there were only little flower pots, and so if it grew at all, it was stunted and died after it filled up the root ball and had no place to get planted. That there are parts of the human psyche, much like a redwood, much like any kind of a tree, that require a certain kind of environment, that if that environment never presents itself, regardless of the nature of the person, regardless of the nature of the seed, if there is no water and no soil for that seed, then it does not germinate. Or if there is a brief burst of that water for that seed, and then drought, it germinates, sprouts, and then dies before it gets to be fully expressed. And this has been a lot of my experience in our culture, is an ongoing longing for certain parts of myself to have a voice and environment, and not coming into that opportunity. I'm in Thailand at the present time, and the reason I'm here, you know, starting at age 36, was that, you know, going back and forth, of course, I don't have citizenship, but the reason I'm here is that there are whole parts of me. There's about a third of me that actually grows in Thailand and withers in the United States, grows in Thailand and withers in the United States. And in an informal questionnaire of more than 50 foreign people from all over the world, including a number of Americans, the consensus is that certain things grow an average of about 500% more. And many of the things that I care about grow about 1,000% more in Thailand than they do in my own country. And so when I'm here, they grow, and when I'm in the US, they wither. Now, this is a very visceral experience for me. That is only a very head experience if you're just don't know what I'm talking about, or haven't spent time noticing and spending months and months at a time to see which parts of you come out in which environment. The final thing that I'd like to say is that reality in many ways is holographic, meaning that if you deeply understand one man, in many ways, you learn something about every man. If you deeply understand every man, you learn something about one man. And in that sense, I'm talking about me not because I stand out, other than to me, of course, but in part because the experiences that are most emotionally impactful and affect me inevitably affect a whole demographic of people. And so in that sense, one of the reasons, having mulled and thought all of this stuff over, that I'm making this video, is to honor the part of you that may never have had time to speak some of the things that I've been taking the time to think, to feel, and to speak. And the other piece is that self-pity is an anesthetic. Self-importance is an anesthetic. They're both coping mechanisms for pain and sometimes shame. And there is a lot of pain, and there's a certain amount of shame here. And so one of the things that I do when I notice myself in self-pity is just be present to the fact that there's more pain than I feel capable of feeling directly without the veneer of self-importance or self-pity. The present moment often has grief. The present moment often has grief, but it can be obscured, it can be insulated to protect some of that pain. And so those are the things that I'm present to as I begin. And so what I want to what this video is about is, how do you disintegrate a person? Now in this paradigm, when you have an integrated rope, it's quite strong. And when you pull on it, it takes a fair amount of friction before it breaks. Now, this, if you do not, if you just have one thing, it takes much less friction. Now, as individuals, we can be integrated in a number of different ways, and we can be disintegrated. And the more disintegrated we are, the more weak we are, the more isolated we are, the less resilient we are, the less healthy we are. And so, for example, when someone does what they say, thinks what they say, feels what they say, you've got heart, mind, and body integrated. Now that's around a particular item. Let's say someone does what they say, thinks what they say, feels what they say around a business transaction. Okay, well, that's a solid transaction, and you will trust the strength of that person if they constantly keep their agreements and this kind of thing. Now, in the same vein, if someone thinks it's a good idea to sign a business contract with you, but they don't like you and want to do it, and they do it, they do what they say they will do it, they think it should be done, and they do it, but they don't feel like doing it, they're weaker. Meaning if you watch their face, they may not show up as on time for the appointment. Part of them doesn't want to be there. They're not going to be proactive in helping the deal work as much. They don't like it. They're going to complain the slightest little thing that goes wrong. See, I didn't want to do this. And it's a weaker connection. If someone thinks it's a bad idea, feels it's a bad idea, says they will do it, and just to be in integrity with their words, does it, now they've split themselves because their own thought and their own mind and their own feeling thinks they should turn right, but they're turning left in order to have integrity with their words. Now they're a divided person. Their words and what they're doing are taking them this way. Their thoughts and feelings that they don't perhaps feel safe to express and articulate, particularly if it's a divergence from the norm, is taking them in another direction. And so they are now a disintegrated person. Now, when you have a disintegration, you have the one self with part of them pulling this way and part of them pulling this way. It's like a tug of war. Well, if 40% their thoughts and feelings are pulling them this way, and their words and their idea that they should always do what they say, and so they're doing what they said they would do, even though they don't think it's a good idea and they don't want to do it. If 40% of them is strong, saying, you know, screw what we said, this is a bad idea, let's not do it. And yet 60% of them is saying, no, I said I would do it, I'm going to keep my word, and I'm going to do it because I don't want to be flaky. Now you've got a 40, 60%. Now you've only got a net profit of 20%. Because you've only got 20% of them pulling this way. So my point is that what happens is that all of us are born with an extraordinary amount of energy, an extraordinary amount of opportunity. And every environment and every situation that divides us is an environment and a situation that weakens us. And what I want to say is that there are environments that are guaranteed to divide an individual. Just one example. Little Jenny is 6 years old, and her father has sex with her on one drunken night. And then tells her, don't tell your mother, or if you tell anyone, I'll kill you, or it will break your mother's heart to tell this and that and the other. And this didn't happen, and it's your fault, and this and that and the other. So this has split Jenny into multiple parts. One part wants to protect her father, that's every child's nature. One part hates her father, so now these are divided. Protect father, hate father. One part gets the message, you don't count, because I choose my addiction over you, and the child hears that I don't count, I'm not valuable. And the other part hears that I'm so important, it's all my fault, meaning my mother will die or have a heart attack or the marriage will fall apart if I don't keep the secret. Now, she goes to school, to Christian school or something and is told you always have to tell the truth. But the same church tells her you must love your parents. But she can't love both parents, you see, because she's keeping a secret from her mother, who can no longer love who she is because she doesn't know who she is, because it's partitioned. Meaning there's a lonely little girl that's terrified one midnight evening as this is happening, and perhaps happens over time again. And the mother can't love and comfort that part because the mother doesn't know that part, because the little girl won't tell that part, because the little girl is choosing the loyalty of her abuser, her father, which means the girl has to decide who she's going to be loyal to for what reason. So this incident alone can split her in multiple ways. First of all, the experience is so overwhelming, she has to dissociate and leave her body. So now her memory of what happened is vague. So she can't protect herself in the future because her memory is vague. Second, the message that she's not worth protecting by her father, which is the message sent by a father sexually abusing his daughter, that you cannot count on me to protect you, is traumatizing, which can lead to a fight, flight, freeze. And the next step and issue is that she loves her mother and wants to include her mother, so that's going this way. But then she doesn't want to break her mother's heart or cause a divorce, so that pulls her the other way. So she's split around what to do. She wants to do what God says, and God says, love your parents and honor them. And her father's told her to keep a secret, and her mother is perhaps participating in the secret by not asking, or perhaps doesn't know to ask. If she does say what's going on, she can't love both her parents, because the dad has defined love as don't tell anyone, and the mom is defining love as tell me everything. But because there is a shameful secret in the sexual abuse, she can't resolve that. Now, my point is, every single one of these areas, little Jenny is split. And every one of those splits weakens her dramatically. Energy has to be spent guarding the secret from mom, protecting the secret from dad. Energy has to be spent if she's internalizing this message that she's not worth anything. Energy has to be spent to in order to say that she is worth it. There's one part of her saying, I'm not worth anything, or dad wouldn't treat me that way. There's one part saying, my feelings don't matter, or rather than keep his secret, he would ask me what I needed. But he's more important than me. I'm not worth loving. And then there's a part saying, you're worth it, you're worth it. You see, and these are now in conflict. And it's only the net, too. Maybe the I'm worth it message gets 5 units of energy, but I'm sure I'm not worth it gets 7 units of energy. There's a net 2 units of energy that's pointing in the direction of this message, I'm not worth it. And then perhaps I eat more because I'm really terrified of these emotional conflicts. Now I'm overweight and I'm getting the message that I'm ugly and I'm not worth it. And so that tips it, highly the other way. So there still is some voice pushing for, yes, I am worth it, yes, I am worth it. But there's a voice tipping hard the other way because of the culture that, rather than helping people in trauma, shames people for the symptoms of trauma. So this is the way that an environment splits an individual or integrates an individual moment by moment, piece by piece. Now, what this story is the story of maybe 30% of the key splits in my life where I'm asked to not be myself and thus to spend energy suppressing parts of myself. And not only not being myself and spend energy suppressing myself, but suppressing the enormous grief of loss as those parts of myself go offline. And so there's parts that are denied. And then there's also these environments which force choosing in different ways. And so as I've been looking to understand the amount of pain, the amount of grief, the amount of exhaustion in an outwardly idyllic life. You know, when I arrived at an outwardly idyllic life and wanted to die, the first thought is, you know, what's this about? And so I've been looking in the assumption that the heart plays the music of pain, pleasure, shame, well-being that reflects the environment, that it's an instrument that is played by the environment, by thoughts, by the culture, and that these feelings bring back a message of what's coming towards us as individuals. So the first series of splits that I am conscious of is watching my mother go from, well, I'll actually speculate a little bit first. So my parents have PTSD from their childhood trauma. And while I didn't know it at the time, the rules within the family that are most important to my parents are that they do not have to feel their emotions, and particularly the helplessness of their emotions around their abuse. And their biggest protection around that is dissociating emotionally. So they are emotionally unavailable, number one. Number two, keeping everyone at bay so that they can't activate those emotions. And so I, as an infant, have emotional need to connect and regulate emotions with my parents. And coming into the world and seeking to attune, the first thing I'm encountering, because when you don't have language and you're not dissociated, a child does actually feel, whether they are repressed or not, the parents' feelings. So my father had enormous amounts of terror, hate, rage, but he was always dissociating and pretending not to feel them and didn't want to own them. But I feel them because they're in his body, because they're intense, because they're repressed there. And so this is the first split, because one part of me is wanting to connect with my father and my mother to learn the male-female template in order to learn regulating skills. And the other part of me is overwhelmed with the grief and the fear and the pain of connecting with my father on an empathic level. And secondly is split by the fact that he's always trying to play it cool. That his favorite aim is to pretend that he has no feelings, that nothing bothers him, that he doesn't have any feelings. And if anything, if he's feeling strongly emotional and doesn't want to deal with it, what he tries to do is make other people feel the feelings he's feeling but doesn't want to deal with. And so a lot of psychological torture happens in the family. So the second thing is he wants to pretend that he doesn't have all these feelings, which he has, which means that he needs the people around him to respond to his language, not what they're feeling in his presence. So this is a split between words and presence and felt experience. So, often when I looked at my father's face, I saw one of the most miserable human beings on the planet. But if you say, Dad, what are you scared of, or what's the pain about, or what's the shame about, or whatever that's, on your face, he would completely deny it. So, and as a young child, he would punish anyone for bringing the correlation of words, empathy, and face. So these were two different worlds. So this is what my body is going through, this is what I'm feeling, and this is what I'm saying I'm going through. And they're completely different narratives. Now, for a child to interact with their parents, and we were raised in relative isolation in upper state New York, a few miles from neighbors, no TV, no media, so the parents are the environment. And so my first exposure to a man is of enormous shame, pain, fear that I can't get close to respond, to love, to heal, to comfort, and my next experience as I learn language is that I have to split my conscious mind to stay present to his language, while this deep emotional instinctual part of me knows that I'm not safe because there's no convergence. It'd be kind of the experience that your body might have if you're looking ahead and you see 500 cars in a big traffic jam and it's not a very safe road conditions, and you look at your GPS and it says there's not a car in sight and there's no traffic and the road conditions are excellent and there's a great weather report. And your boss tells you, follow the GPS. You say, there's all this traffic, and they said, well, is there any traffic on the GPS? And you say, no. They said, follow the GPS, do what the GPS says. But your body knows that what's actually going on could kill you. And it's much more integral than the words, than the GPS. And in the same way, a child knows that in order not to be punished, I cannot talk about the deep pain, shame, and terror in my father. And I cannot talk about the fact that emotionally he's about 6 years old when a lot of his abuse happened. But I have to instead go off on these long, fascinating distraction of a mental journey that has nothing to do with what's going on. And I've got to relate to him on that level. And there's another thing that's going on, which is that my father feels very humiliated. And he needs to feel a certain superiority to those around him in order to feel like he can cope with the helplessness, with the humiliation, with the shame, with the terror. He masks that with a superiority. And in that sense, my job in making him feel good enough to protect me and not hate me and not attack me, my job is to make him feel superior and important, which is to make myself look and feel inferior so that he feels good enough about himself that he likes the relationship. People with PTSD who are adult children, they feel 6-year-old and stuck in a trauma or something, but are adult children, are incapable of putting another person first. They're very self-centered, which is the nature of trauma. It wasn't the nature of my father. You see, my father was split and divided and retarded and regressed in a similar way. But I'm just telling the same pattern that I witnessed more firsthand in my own life because I wasn't there to watch the exact ways it occurred, when he was growing up. I just know that his abuse was worse than mine by evidence of the fact that his mother died and was an alcoholic, and his father was more violent to me than my father was. And typically grandparents, when there's not too much exposure, give the grandchild a little bit more grace than they give their children. So the fact that he was more violent with me than my father suggests that he was even more violent with my father than he was with me, which means a lot more abuse. And then there was also even more emotional dissociation. My grandfather came back from the Second World War and was just kind of out of it emotionally, and really protected anyone from getting close to his feelings. So by 5 years old, I'm already doing a couple of splits. One, I'm protecting my father and the marriage by keeping his affairs, kind of somewhat under wraps. Two, I'm making myself look stupid so that he can feel smart, even though it hurts me every single time. So one part of me is saying, I don't want to be in this role. I don't want to be making myself look stupid. The other part is focusing on the impact it has on him and the fact that this brings a greater bond, meaning there is no emotional bond with my mother or my father. So I've got to find some basis for confident rapport so that I can build social regulating skills. And making myself look dumb and making him look smart is one of those ways to do that. And by playing along with his mental games and helping him avoid his feelings is another way of doing that. But to do that, I've also got to split my own feelings. Because if I've constantly got terror and pain going on, I can't go on these mental journeys that he's asking me to go on. So I've actually got to bury and pretend that my feelings don't exist to help him feel that his feelings don't exist. Now, I'm also in a culture and in a time when chauvinism is extremely deep on two levels. first of all, there's all of the patronizing, denigrating treatment of my father to my mother, how dumb she is, and this is also an interesting pattern. She's also enrolled in looking dumb to make him feel better so that he'll provide and won't pout and punish not only us but her. And this is partly, logistical, meaning he married her as an employee in one of his restaurants, and she had no experience with making money or anything. And so, when he lifted her standard of living, then and did not support or encourage her to learn life skills and financial skills, then part of the deal is that she'll do things to him to make him feel good, in this case help him feel important, which includes making her feel dumb in a certain way, and also taking his patronizing comments about women. So there's my father's patronizing comments about women, and there are the culture's patronizing views of women. There's the absence of female leaders and all of this kind of institutionalized chauvinism between men and women. There's the pay gap. There's a whole system of that kind of thing. But there's also the deeper form of chauvinism that says that the feminine nature, that emotion, that need, that vulnerability, that listening, that receptivity, that trust and trusting, that diffuse awareness, that the circle and the group, that spontaneous presence is all as feminine traits, as feminine qualities in both men and women. Meaning every man has some degree of these traits. I mean, you gotta, even if you talk almost all the time, you've got to at least listen to what the other person says enough so that you can argue with them. You've got to receive communication to intelligently give it at least some of the time. You've got to receive money from clients before you can pay it to to your employees. So there is the masculine side in every man is the focused, speaking, initiating, get to the point, strategic planning, lineal logic, leading, initiating, mental, make it happen, get it done part of every human being. And the feminine part of every man is the emotional, is the attuning, the listening, the awareness of the circle, the spontaneous moment, the presence, the more diffuse awareness, the joy, the receiving, the openness. This is the feminine part of every man and woman. Vice versa. There's a masculine and feminine pole, a yin and a yang in every woman and in every man. The hormones tend to predispose a lot more men to being more masculine than feminine. Just testosterone, for example, leads men to initiate more. Visual acuity from ancestor in the hunting kind of domain, and the slightly more athletic bodies of men, again, just historically based, tend to emphasize the masculine. But hormonally, it might just be a 65%, 45% split, with many men being very androgynous and some men being more feminine, etc. But in our culture, the outer success and wealth is more valuable than the inner success and wealth, masculine over feminine. Thoughts, which we learn about in formal education, are way more valuable than feelings, which we do not learn at all in formal education. Getting things done is way more important, masculine, than how you feel about what is and isn't done. Strategy and good plans is considered much more valuable in business than the spontaneity of the moment in a culture that is organized around money, an external symbol of value, rather than organized around the felt well-being of the people emotionally, in a culture that will measure GDP, GNP, gross national product, etc., but will not measure emotional well-being. It will measure every year how much lumber is produced here as a symbol of wealth on a masculine metric. How many trees did you cut down? It will not measure what's the quality of your breathing, since there's all that particulate matter from all those absent trees being burned. How do you feel this year? That's not measured. That's feminine. The objective more masculine, the subjective more feminine. Well, science itself tends to dismiss anything that is subjective and emphasize what is objective. As a result, when you do a physical and a checkup, nobody asks how you feel on an emotional level or why. They ask what you're eating, and they measure your body, without honoring the fact that they go hand in hand, that people who are depressed eat more of this kind of stuff, people who are in trauma tend to get more obese to manage the trauma, etc., etc., etc. And so there is a process of culturally sanctioning the masculine and shaming, discounting, dishonoring the feminine in a way that adds to this split. So every man and every woman in America that wants to be valued culturally is asked to split their masculine and feminine, first of all, when the most natural thing is synergy and to work in integrated partnership. The yin and the yang is drawn as equal shapes in one of our oldest cultures, Chinese culture, because much like a battery, if you have an equal positive and negative charge, much like a battery, it creates more electricity more sustainably than if you have 100% positive charge and just 20% negative charge. Now, this is true within the human brain. You get the most creativity, the most productivity, the most well-being when you equally develop the feminine and masculine and equally develop the right and the left brain, which correspond. The artistic, intuitive brain being more feminine, the strategic, lineal logic brain being more masculine. Now, this makes perfect sense when you understand that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are more miserable in their felt experience than certain right brain, highly in-tuned, intuitive, and spontaneous people. The research actually suggests that people who are more likely to be in kind of a professorial type of job, doing lineal logic and have that part of them really lit up, and a less developed right brain, they are less happy than people who have a well-developed right brain. People who honor their feminine in a really beautiful way are more happy as people than the people that do not honor the feminine. And so this is the data, but within the lens of chauvinism, this is not important. Meaning, once you discount subjective experience in a self-referential loop, then the fact that the richest man in the world doesn't feel very good doesn't matter. Because he should feel good, because his life is good, objectively, and that's all that counts. And so let's count his planes, let's count his Ferraris, let's count his mansions, let's do documentaries about their houses, and nobody asks them if their feelings have gone up and down. In fact, you've probably never seen a YouTube or a documentary about the feelings of the wealthiest people, or for that matter, who are the 400 happiest people on the planet. That documentary in a chauvinistic culture wouldn't get made because it's a feminine value, happiness. So why would anyone want to know how happy these people were when they could learn how many Ferraris they have? Now, in a chauvinistic culture where we've been taught to view things chauvinistically, we're more impressed with the Ferraris than how happy they are. So this is perfectly fine. The chauvinism is instinctual. But this is a cultural rift within the psyche of every single human being in the Western culture, where every boy in particular is asked to partition their feelings in order to separate their masculine from their feminine, and they're asked to develop their masculine and shame their feminine. They're asked to look with patronizing disgust and disdain at their own needs and at the needs of women and at the needs of children. And real men don't want to really play with little infants. That's a woman's thing, because all that attuning and responsiveness is so less than important than the cocktail party with bigwigs from Fortune 500 companies who are, of course, none of them asked how they feel, how their health is, what their spontaneity is, what their joy, none of them are asked about that. They're asked, how much money did you make last quarter? Did this go up or down in ratio, your net profit, this and that, masculine traits, and they are assessed that way. Nobody's asking their employees, how do they feel working it this way rather than this way, because it doesn't matter as long as the employees deliver the numbers. The feelings don't matter. In a chauvinistic culture, this is the message. So chop number one is split and be kept away from my parents' feelings, where every time I try and connect and attune to their deep emotions, they're pushing me away because they don't want to feel their deep emotions through the mirror neurons that awaken in a child. So this is number one. Number two is my father did not want to feel any of the deep fear, which means that my body's picking it up, but I'm splitting my mind off to follow his journey. And the third split is I don't want to feel stupid and less than, but I want to have attention and camaraderie with my father, and the only way he knows how to do that. And so I'm making myself look dumb so he can look smart, because then he feels better about himself and treats me better. Fourthly, I'm keeping his unfaithfulness to my mother, which is a betrayal of the part of me that is over there, wanting to love her equally. A child doesn't come in trying to love one more than the other. If anything, the bond is closer with the mother. So there's that betrayal. There's also the deep alarm, meaning these four things raise deep alarm, and I'm hiding that deep alarm so that they will feel more comfortable, because they don't want to feel like anything's wrong. They want to feel like everything's fine. So I'm hiding the deep alarm, which is another form of suppressed energy and dissociation. Then I'm learning culturally and from my father's patronizing humiliation of my mother that half of me, my masculine trait, is significantly more important and valuable than my feminine trait, and that it is better than my feminine trait, and that my attitude towards my own femininity should be patronizing superiority as opposed to joy, gratitude, and wonder. And so this is, this is all that I'm learning. I'm just raising this up a little bit here. So this is on my father's side by the time that I'm 5 years old. Now there's one other big dissociation, which is that I'm in that category that Dr. Elaine Aron identifies among a number of mammalian species as being highly sensitive in the neurological connections. That this does not mean in any way better than, but nature produces a divergence in its people for survival traits, kind of specializing. And 10 to 20% of the population have a more sensitive response network to the environment, and they suffer a great deal in our cult because the environment is built for everyone else. It's kind of as if 10 to 20% of the people have the volume turned up an extra 50 to 200%. And so what's a comfortable volume for everyone else feels a bit painful for the sensitive. What's a comfortable jogging and kind of workout for everyone else is a little bit intense for the sensitive. What is a vague feeling for everyone else is a very sharp, crystalline, strong feeling for the sensitive. Now, this just brings all of these tensions into sharper focus at, maybe as, my sense is around 75% more focused and intense. Now, this is on my father's side, and I'm just 5 years old. On my mother's side, same deep dissociation from feelings, which she does with fantasies. So she creates fantasies about reality, and then she lives in the fantasy. So I become one of her fantasies. And I have to figure out who she's fantasizing I am. And then I have to decide whether to be myself and be punished, or adopt myself into her fantasy and be accepted and please her. Now, I also, part of her fantasy in her teenage self, so she's about 4 years old emotionally a lot of the time, but she has kind of the sexual curiosity of a 17-year-old. So she's got these two ages, like 17-year-old, 4-year-old. Now, the 4-year-old is really scared and very terrified and dissociated, and my mother does not want to feel that young age. Now, the 17-year-old is because that 4-year-old is banished, and the phenomena of adult children, when the body grows up but the emotions do not mature with the body because they've been suspended in a frozen state of trauma. You can't build on a base that is denied. And like a tree, every age builds on the ages, inside of it. And so trauma is one of the ways that maturity gets frozen. And because that little girl who had been sexually abused by her father has been pushed away, the empathy with the young boy is low and pushed away. The feminine inside me is not sensitively attuned to, because it is the tenderness towards that terrified, lonely 4-year-old in her that would expand out to be tender to the 4-year-old, the 5-year-old, the 6-year-old, etc. in me. What she does have is a somewhat sociopathic, meaning it's not empathic, curiosity. It hasn't stopped her mind. This culture dwells on her mind. So this culture took this 4-year-old and sent her to school, and her mind developed. And she watched movies, and she has all the curiosities, etc. And so there's this kind of teenage energy that's very sexually curious and precocious. And my father is perhaps her first lover. And she doesn't feel safe on some level with men. But here's this little boy, and she's curious. But it's not the empathic protection of a mother. It's the sexual curiosity of a teenager with this thing that is not hers. It's disowned on an emotional level. It's not integrated, because that 4-year-old in her was disowned, because that 4-year-old had no protection. Her mother was passive. Her father was incredibly hostile and passive-aggressive. And she was raised in the same cult that says, love your parents, honor your parents, rather than a 10th commandment that says, protect and honor your children. No, it's a one-way thing, and it's backwards. It's the parent, through the unconditional and protection of the child, that gives the imprint to the child so that when the child has a child of their own, they can teach and love their own children the way they were loved. It starts with the parent showing up for the child, not the child showing up for the parent. That happens naturally. If you help a child feel completely secure in their physical needs, and then feel love and belonging with a sense of safety, and then a sense of self-esteem as they develop skills and values, and then develop their ability to contribute and ultimately transcend in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these children love to give. And so this is a this is a big split. And I want to pause this for a moment and bring in a little bit of meta conversation. And one of the phenomenal things in a culture with as much sexual abuse as ours, in a culture with as much trauma as ours, in a culture with a history of as much slavery, trauma, and abuse as ours, in a culture where 1 in 3 domestic couples participate in some form of domestic violence, according to relative conservative statistics. In a culture that is highly chauvinistic, even to this day, women make less money for the same performance. In a culture that doesn't send out a single emotional census for the entire life of the population, meaning despite the fact that it's virtually free and could be calculated by an app. You get this? The United States government could, if it were not chauvinistic, develop an app and ask every American citizen to sign up by email and say how happy they were on an emotional level about every area of their life, what their emotional makeup was, and could create for free or a few $1,000,000 a map of the emotional state of the American population, of the health state of the American population. See, we rely on these bizarre, expensive studies in lieu of this, because in a sociopathic and chauvinistic culture, we've never heard a president say, your feelings, man or woman, is as important as how much money you're making, which the data supports. Sonia Lyubomirsky in her studies on happiness, after you've got survival taken care of, it's love, belonging, quality of relationships that determines happiness. But that's not what we measure. So you are never going to get, and you've never gotten, I'm 43 years old, there could have, in any moment over the last 43 years, my government could have sent me a questionnaire. In the old days, paper, now free on email, asking me how I feel and why, and tracking it next year and seeing is it getting better or worse for me, for this state, etc., and could be doing things about it or supporting us to do things about it by sharing data and research. In a chauvinistic cult, that doesn't happen. In an intelligent cult, it happens because if you're feeling depressed, a granite countertop is not going to make a big deal in whether you're depressed or not. But knowing that someone cares about you enough to ask might. And one is $5,000 for the granite countertop, the other is free. So it doesn't make sense when depression is one of the biggest costs in the U.S. economy, costing billions and billions of dollars every year, and is is one of the leading worldwide causes. Even if you only care about money, it makes sense to take an emotional census. But because that's feminine, it doesn't occur to a chauvinistic cult to do it for free. It just doesn't come up because the thoughts are slanted off a certain way. But the meta conversation is how does a cult of any kind protect itself from the infiltration of the values that would heal its imbalances or its cultishness. A cult is something that is irrational, but everyone's doing it. Chauvinism is irrational. But if you're born into a cult in which everyone is chauvinistic, you behave chauvinistically to fit in because it is rational to belong. And if you have to be irrational in order to belong, it will be rational to be irrational. And you'll have another generation of chauvinism. Now, how does a cult protect its chauvinism in this case? How does it protect its self-referential insanity of one form or another? And every cult has it. You look at the data and you look at what the majority of people are doing, and you say, this isn't intelligent. And you say, well, why are they doing it? And it's like, well, everyone else is doing it. And that's a cult. It's like, well, that's why we say culture. It's out of that root sense, conformity over rationality, tradition over intelligence. And there's a value to that because then we don't have to think. There's also a cost because it's not always intelligent. This area it is, this area it was intelligent 100 years ago, not today. You know, like we haven't updated the school curriculum because of Google or phone calculators or anything like that. We're doing what made sense 200 years ago or 100 years ago, and that's not intelligent, that's cult-like. And we're sacrificing our children for the cult because our children are not getting the education they need. They're getting the cult education they don't need, but that fits in with what everyone else is doing. Now, a cult defends its irrational behavior with self-referential values. For example, we defend the right of two parents with PTSD to have as many children as they want, despite the data that suggests that there's a 98% chance that they're going to give PTSD to their child because it's a contagious disease. Because when you're dissociated, you can't attune to an infant, and you are 30 times bigger than that infant, and that infant is completely dependent on you. So the most vulnerable segment of the population, infants, are being handed to people in mental emotional disease with certainty of abuse in the name of a self-referential value. Like, so for example, the United States is all about freedom. Now the government interferes in almost everything. I'm trying to get married with my Philippine girlfriend, and I have had 1 year and about $100,000 worth of interference from my government. So there's you know, we have no trouble, you know, take off your shoes, take off your belt, you know, walk this way, stick your hands up here, let me pat you down. We have no issue whatsoever with invading all kinds of things and violating this thing, freedom. But with the parent dynamic, with the most vulnerable, you know, so we do this because one skyscraper got blown up. But we have tens, you know, we have millions of abused children every year. And we're all about this self-referential thing. Oh, we can't bother parents' freedom. We couldn't possibly give them a textbook on PTSD. We couldn't give them free psychological examination prior to have a child for anyone that cared enough about their children to get a psych exam. We couldn't do that, you know, because that would protect the life of an innocent child that's being abused, you know, to the tune of millions on a yearly basis. And that's no big deal. But a building gets knocked down, fine, you know, take off your belt, do this every single time you fly. And so there's this bizarre schizophrenia in these types of things. In part, that allowed the military to expand, etc., with the Patriot Act, and that's been going on since 1950, is, you know, an irrational military expansion in which we spend more than the next 25 countries combined on military stuff and pretend that we don't even have enough food or money to have health insurance for our own people, compared to a small country like Denmark, where every single person has a college degree without any student debt. Every single person has great health insurance, has great work insurance, loves their job, is happy with their government, and has a much better environment and architectural workplace. I've interviewed them. They don't have a big military spending budget. And so, is it rational or is it cultish to insist on spending 25 times more than the next person, you know, the next country, when the only terrorist that is certain, So the United States killed 500,000 innocent Iraqis. That's by our own estimates. 500,000 innocent Iraqis. Do you think they felt terrified, any of them? Any of those people felt terrified? Do you think their families felt terrified? Do you think Iraq felt terrified? So are we the biggest terrorist country in the world? Did we create more terror in the years of those killings than any other nation on the planet, including North Korea? Were 500,000 people killed in North Korea that year? Were we the #1 exporter of terror? Or what we're doing in Afghanistan, or what we're doing to political prisoners, or what we're doing to animal rights activists? Is any of that creating terror? You can't prosecute a war on terror when you're creating more terror than anyone else around the entire planet. Well, we just name it different things. We just call it the war on terror and go out and create terror. And the $8 trillion spent on our last little gambit couldn't possibly have paid for health care for people that mattered, because they were people. And nobody's measuring the depression and the exhaustion that they don't matter in their own country, or the PTSD of some of our Iraqi veterans who have to relive the memories of machine gunning down 6-year-old little girls because they might have been carrying a mortar if they had a backpack on, or something like this. It's an absolute nightmare for these human beings. But we do this protection where we have this concept called privacy, first of all. We don't call it loneliness, isolation, and willful ignorance, which is another name for nobody knowing what Americans are feeling as a percentage. Is anger going up or down over the last decade, for example, by state, by gender, by nation, by age demographic? We don't know that. Not because it costs a lot of money to know it, but because we don't want to know it. And we're proud of it, rather than saying, oh my goodness, a third of who we are is emotional, and we have no fucking idea what we feel. This is an outrage. We turn it around. The cult turns it around and says, no, we value your privacy. No one has a right to know what you feel. What if it was turned around again and said, we value your sense of belonging to this culture. No one has a right to exclude you or act as if you don't have feelings just because we can't be bothered to learn what you feel about everything important in your life. Or be intelligent enough and sophisticated enough to create metadata. Oh, nobody should know what you feel? That's fine. Why don't you just break it down by state? Everyone's name is erased, but the app filters in that it is a legitimate person, and then deletes the personal information, and we get to know everything important emotionally in every state with metadata, where nobody's privacy is violated. Or what if we give people the choice? Do you want people to know that you've been sexually abused by this Catholic church and then protected in this way, and your senator didn't listen, and and this is an outrage and you'd like to protect other people? Or do you want to keep it private and have it be in metadata, and we have a sense of how many rape and incest situations happen by each religion type, so that in every state we see which state is the highest in sexual abuse, and which religion is the highest, and which religion is the most effective at covering it up, and which religion addresses it head on. And we can have gradients of emotional and sexual and cultural safety by educating the people that this data is free to everyone. Anyone can look, not the personal information, but the metadata. It says, well, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And so this is you know, so we have a sense in our cult that I'm doing something unusual and a bit odd. One, I'm talking about my parents. I've changed my last name legally, and so it's, you know, my father's dead. My mother doesn't like hearing these kinds of things, so she's not going to be listening to this. And, you know, but there's just the idea of a betrayal, for example, that this isn't right, that this is meant to be in therapists, that we should be protecting the secrecy and the privacy of what's going on emotionally in our own countries, that money is no big deal because there's nothing shameful about money. If you know how much money they made in this corporation or that corporation or this CEO made, and it's published in you know, SEC reports, that's fine. But you should never ask, you know, that company CEO if they were sexually abused or if they sexually abused their child or anything like that. That should not be known. And the question is, who does that serve? Does that serve the shareholders? Does it serve the child who's been sexually abused? Does it serve the conspiracy of silence in which, you know, just a few decades ago, there was a psychological evaluation of the amount of incest in the United States, and it was that 1 in 4 million American girls was incestuously abused by her father. Now, this statistic is off by thousands. You know, it's I'm not sure the exact statistic of that, if it's 1 in 10, but you know, we're dealing with 1 in 4 American women dealing with sexual abuse in one form or another. And it not only said 1 in 4 women were incestuously abused, but it then went on to say that the woman had some psychological benefits, that she was better able to sexually please her husband, that kind of thing, because of the sexual incest. And this is complete nonsense. But in this kind of secrecy thing where nobody is talking about it, you know, no man until a week ago talked to me about his mother sexually abusing him. And this was a psychologist, you know, who had all kinds of trauma and issues, etc. And this is the first time that a man has talked to me about that. And and I hadn't realized it until a few months earlier, because no parent sits you down and says, this is sexual abuse, what I'm doing, just so you know, because this is a cult that doesn't talk about any of this. Now, this is another interesting thing. I've worked with 30 practitioners in mental emotional well-being and spent more than $150,000 on these 30 practitioners. And none of them asked about sexual abuse. None of them asked about sexual abuse. And none of them went into the details so that I would know what was and wasn't sexual abuse. And so if even the therapists are shy to ask the questions that would allow a therapeutic patient to do the work to clear out the, you know, the misconceptions, etc., and then we have a cult that says, oh, that's inappropriate, don't talk about that, and don't talk about that, and don't talk about that, it becomes a pattern of willful ignorance and denial within the cult, in which a person can go from cradle to grave as a sexual abuse survivor and not have a single human being acknowledge it as abuse, witness it as abuse, and be a witness. And that's outrageous. And yet, when we have a self-referential cult that just deifies things like privacy and freedom, not freedom to talk about sexual abuse, freedom to abuse your children and not talk about it, freedom to raise your children as you see fit without interference, meaning we're not going to protect your child if you abuse them. We're not going to interfere. Now, we'll interfere if you abuse us, or if your children grow up and abuse adults, the adults will be protected, but the child who's learning how to be abusive and who's likely to externalize it as an adult doesn't get protected. Now, obviously, it takes more effort to protect. You have to preempt. How about a psych exam for all parents? With more checkups done on parents who choose not to have a psych exam, to give the child safe environments to communicate what is going on in their homes, and if they need any support and help, and if so, what kind. You know, that's the kind of country that is an intelligent country, because nipping this kind of stuff in the bud is way cheaper. Meaning not having sexual abuse and PTSD and trauma with a few $5 pamphlets, some parent courses for, you know, $30 a piece is about 10,000 times cheaper than me spending 40 years and $150,000 and counting to try and resolve stuff, because nobody spent that $5 on a pamphlet to educate my parents that they had PTSD. They didn't know. They're in denial, in an emotionally denying culture. Men in particular do not want to admit that they might have a mental emotional disease, because this culture will turn around and shame them rather than apologize to them. So this is just a little bit of meta conversation as I'm aware of the taboo of talking about personal issues rather than just referencing aggregate data, talking about it emotionally rather than just referencing it as a statistic, and talking about it with my parents and family as opposed to other people, or changing names and all that. We don't like looking at certain parts of this cult, certain parts of our families, so we don't. And then we don't fully like it when someone transgresses those boundaries. So that being said, when my mother connected with me sexually, I didn't know what sex was. I think it was, you know, there was a willful effort to keep media and any kind of that kind of stuff out of view, though I did find my father's Playboy magazines. That was kind of my first exposure to sex, again, without fully knowing what it was. It was just, you know, naked ladies was how I thought of it. And so my mother related to me sexually in a couple of ways. One was her flirtatious, giggling relationship. Two was the baby powder on the whole body, including the penis, and kind of a little exploring around there to see what, you know, how I would respond. And three, engaging with me in fantasy and relational like a lover. And four, inviting her sisters over into somewhat similar engagement. Her sisters presumably also sexually abused. 5, encouraging nudity in me as a 10-year-old boy, like when swimming. And her sisters taking photographs of me nude and all of them in this isolation protocol in which they all knew that this was not normal behavior in our culture for a 10-year-old. But because it was isolated, meaning upstate rural New York, because the environment, the media, and because they were controlling the environment, they had the ability to create this pocket of ignorance for us children, in which they were the only ones that knew about the outside culture and what was and wasn't common, and they could suggest things that were not common. And then I was aware of being an object in that, and I was aware of being asked to perform for their object viewing. And there's something lonely about that. And I didn't notice the correlation until I was playing with some young Thai children in the water. We were all swimming together. And there were 5 little girls in the 5 to 10-year age group range. And of course, they're innocent about sexuality. And I found myself psychologically, physically, I was very careful to avoid behaving in any way sexually, and not to come in contact with their genitals. They had clothes on, but still they're piling on top of me and rolling around. And on one level, it was completely innocent and fun. But on another level, my mind was relating to them as sexual objects in the exact template of the energy that I felt from my mother to me and from my mother's sisters to me. That I was an erotic object for them. And it is only in relatively recent psychological studies that this kind of emotional template is even acknowledged as sexual abuse. In other words, if you relate to your child as a sexual object, there's a part of them that gets the message on an emotional level. This is how you relate to children. Children are sexual objects. It's not personal. That children are learning how to be in the world, and their template is coming from their parents. Now, my father, in another dissociation, hit me, beat me, belted me. Now, being in that highly sensitive category, I left my body. It was too terrifying and too painful. So I'm also learning that in order to satisfy my father, he's got to cause so much pain that I need to leave my body. I've got to dissociate and disintegrate it. It's another chop in the psyche. I can't be present in my body, first for the experience, second for the memory. I cannot, to this day, go into the memory, meaning I can look from above the ground. I can look from above the ground, and I can get flashes of the belt, and I can get flashes of my cringing as he was coming towards me to hit me. But I can't be in the body feeling it, either then or now. Meaning the same panic of going into the memory and feeling what it felt like to be that little boy. I have no idea. I'm looking at it like an adult because I can't be present to it as a little boy. Well, this locks the dissociation in place, because until you can grieve and feel what's going on in the memory as the boy, not as the abuser or as an adult watching. One doesn't know what he experienced. One doesn't understand the depth of the terror. And it is adults who have dissociated while they were being beaten, who never felt what it was like to be there because they blocked it. They blocked it then, they blocked the memory because it was so painful and terrifying, that now they say that was no big deal because they're not feeling the experience from the perspective of the child who was so overwhelmed they left. It dissociated them, and it caused a rift of severe panic. Now this rift, the fact that my mother treated me as an object, and the fact that my father terrified me to such an extent that I had to leave my body, and the fact that both of them never welcomed me into their emotional world because it was too painful and they were busy distracting, and the fact that they wanted me to distract them from their emotions, and I became hyperactive to produce lots and lots of adrenaline in myself and in them so as not to feel what was going on. And some of that was in response to the beating. It's like, if I'm really hyperactive, I won't feel it when it happens. So I became very hyperactive. That is a chemical split. When you're hyperactive and you're too revved up or you're depressed on the other side, when you're manic depressive, in both states, you're not present. You're not present here. You're rushing forward or you're not engaging. It's this place of presence that exists when you have a healthy, safe environment, that you know you're not going to be harmed, that you know you're going to be protected, when you are welcomed into the emotional world of both your parents. Now, this hyperactivity led into some OCD, and the symptom of a learning disability, meaning the environment was too terrifying to be present in that environment with no one else looking at what was going on. Now this is another split, because I'm demonstrating shyness, I'm demonstrating hyperactivity, I'm demonstrating shame, I'm demonstrating that I can't connect with others because I'm being taught that at home. There's nothing wrong with me at birth. There's nothing wrong with my physiology. This is a coping strategy for repeated excessive trauma. So I'm split these 5 ways with my father, plus the beating is 6. Then there's the split with self to please mother sexually and to perform, not be myself, but to see myself through their lens as an object. There's also, because my mother treats me as if I'm in a fantasy, there's also a desire to actually connect with her, and the only way I could get my mother to be real and present with me was to upset her. And so I spent a lot of my childhood learning how much I could upset her without being hit, so that I could have a few moments with her being fully present with me. But one of the things that would often happen is she would go from being completely unpresent and in her fantasy to being intensely raging, but not seeing me, seeing her abuser. So she would go in from this vacuous state into this place of intense hatred and rage towards me, which gave me the message that I was this hated and raging, the horrible person, which I couldn't figure out because I was trying to connect in every way and cared about her a great deal. But that wasn't welcome. She wasn't present for that. She would only be present. Then there's the sexual object, we've got stay away from mother emotionally, then we've got be the fantasy, be in the fantasy with her, and she'd have, talk about boys and men and stuff, and it wasn't me, and ask how I felt and stuff like that. She'd talk about, well, boys are like this, and girls. It was part of her fantasy world. And then she would beat me at times, which was another dissociation. And there was another level with my mother of, well, and this was actually in different ways. There was another level with my mother that was illustrated with the swing, where, as someone who's highly sensitive, this swinging motion on this giant swing over the lake and over a bunch of rocks and logs, this huge swing, I felt so ticklish with the rush of air going through back and forth in my body that I laughed uncontrollably, and I could feel my hands losing the grip. And I was aware that if I fell off in the over the lake, that I was scared of, one, the snapping turtles, and two, I don't remember if I could swim at that time, but it was certainly, it was a high fall into the lake. It was not, that didn't feel safe. And if I fell off on the land, I could crack my head on a rock or a log. And so I knew my life was in danger, and I started pleading with my mother to stop swinging me. And she laughed and ignored it. And I did a quick calculation that I wouldn't be able to hold on for another 10 seconds. And I thought, my mother is too dumb to know what she's exposing me to. She's in her own fantasy world in which she's telling me that I'm enjoying it because I'm laughing when I'm terrified that I'm going to fall off. And she's not going to respect what I say, because she doesn't respect my boundaries. She doesn't include me in that. So I've got to come up with a strategy that reflects something she does care about, which is herself and her own concept. So for the first time in my life, I called her a bitch. I said, "You bitch." And I knew what would happen, not because of my safety. She would immediately try and catch me to punish me, and then I could get off the swing, and I wouldn't be at risk of falling off and cracking my head open. Now, this would never occur to her that this was a great courtesy, meaning if I had died on cracked head because she hadn't respected the boundary, she would have to leave her fantasy land of being the perfect mother and deal with the fact that she had killed her child who had pleaded with her. Or maybe she'd invent a new fantasy that I'd told her to push. Maybe by the time she got up the hill, it would be Dane was telling me to push her. Me more and more, I was so worried I asked him to stop, but he just kept telling me to push, so maybe she'd get around it. Who knows what her fantasies are covering up. But either way, this is a hard thing for parents to kill their child and know it was out of stupidity and lack of respect of intelligence and boundary. So I saved her from that, and I saved my own life. And her only concern was, the self-centeredness that I'd insulted her. It wasn't my life is in danger. It wasn't how upset I had to be to get to that point. It wasn't that I knew her enough to know that I had to insult her before she would immediately stop, that anything else wasn't likely to work because she's so self-centered. That doesn't go through her mind. What goes through her mind is my ungrateful, horrible child. How dare he, after all I've done for him, da-da-da-da-da. Now, I have to split my reality and experience of those kind of things and let her reality be dominant. In other words, she has to have the ability to have her version of reality that I'm a horrible, ungrateful child, rather than that she's a dishonoring and not very intelligent parent. She just isn't occurring to her that if I fell off at this point or this point or this point, this could happen, this could happen, this point, could happen. And as a child, I have to live in both realities. I have to take care of my physical body in the reality that counts. But the reality that counts for her, I've got to play and accept the role that I'm this horrible person. Because if I fight that role, she will punish me for lying. She'll tell me that I'm lying. She'll tell me I'm being sassy. I'm talking back to her when she's telling her version of reality. So I have to split again into two versions so that she can be indulged in the feelings based on fantasy. I have to pretend that my feelings of profound disgust and resentment of a parent that is so immature that not only do they endanger their own child, but they don't support the child when they try and protect their own boundaries. And then they're so self-centered and narcissistic that they ask the child to support the faulty reality in which they're just trying to ruin her life, basically, as opposed to save her life. Because it does tend to ruin most marriages and lives if a parent kills a child accidentally. It's a very difficult thing for a marriage to get over. So in the same way that I'm being split between the part of me that doesn't want to be dumb and the part of me that needs my father to feel superior so that he'll like me, I'm splitting between the part of me that is terrified and enraged and bitter and angry at my mother, and the part that has to pretend that I'm a bad person because that's the only reality she will accept, or she will punish me some more. It's easier to go along with her version of reality